Preparatory remarks. Mr. President, you allowed your generosity to outstrip your judgment, and I'm very grateful. I assume you all know how honored and happy I am to be here. Some of you may think I look like Stravinsky's Firebird. But it's a role that was given me when I left Burnside, and I thought I ought to overcome my natural shyness. And finally, by way of explanation, may I say that 4 years ago, when I suffered a stroke, I tried to console myself with Mark Twain's observation about Wagner's music. It's better than it sounds. I would hope the sermon will be better than it sounds. War, after all, is the most chronic and incurable disease that humanity has caught. Plato said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." Lamented Jeremiah, "We looked for peace, but no peace came." Still, if we give up on peace, we give up on God. So, I propose we talk of three things crucial to any hope for world peace. 1, patriotism. What is your view of it? 2, the force of law versus the law of force. Which will it be? And 3, disarmament, is it a pipe dream? Let me close with words of Abraham Lincoln. In December of 1862, he addressed the American Congress on the subject of the abolition of slavery. His words today are just as pertinent on the subject of the abolition of nuclear weapons. Said the President, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country. And you and I can add, save the world." As I said at the outset, to give up on peace is to give up on God. So I hope we'll spend the coming week thinking deeply about patriotism, what it means, about the law of force versus the force of law, and about disarmament. Most of all, what is each of us personally going to do about all three? Let us pray.
William Sloane Coffin, what's he mean to Joan Brown Campbell?
Watching William Sloane Coffin, which was his last public sermon, which was given here at Chautauqua, he means a lot to me. He was my teacher and certainly a mentor for me. I lived across the street from Riverside Church for 20 years almost. And so I was a parishioner at Riverside Church, and I listened to him regularly. And I'll never forget one time when I went to visit him about something, I don't remember what, but his apartment had books everywhere. A book here, a book there, all marked, all underlined, and papers with each one. And I said to him, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm writing a sermon." And I said, "Oh, this warms my heart." I mean, he said, "Well, I'll only use about half of these." But Bill Coffin was known for having the perfect quote, the perfect reference for whatever it was that he was preaching about. His sermons were always less than 15 minutes long. They were short, they were pointed, they were excellent. In many ways, he was a teacher for me about preaching, but most of all, he taught me about living life. I mean, he lived a real life, not always a traditional life, but he was God's man all the way. And I admired him very, very much. But I always, when I write a sermon, I get all these books out and I put markers in them, and then I go back and I get quotes. And so when I saw him, I thought, oh, this is wonderful. This isn't just crazy, it's probably actually the way to do it. And he said, well, I only use about a quarter of these, but I have to read. And he always had in every sermon the perfect quote that made the point of what it was he was trying to make. And I think the gift of Bill Coffin was that he was not, as society would define him, as a religious man. He lived a genuine and interesting life, and he had a holiness about him that very few would call holy. But he knew what the world was about, and he knew what the issues were. And he was a minister at Riverside the whole time I was at the National Council of Churches. And so in many ways we were in ministry together, and he was very much a partner in that. And I remember one thing very well that he said to me when he said, well, one thing I've learned, if you tell your friends you're dying, all your enemies become your friends. And he said, because he was told that he would have very short time to live, and he said, I've decided I better go because they're beginning to be my enemies again. So, I mean, his sense of humor was, there's lots of Bill Coffin stories I could tell you. I mean, and I think the most powerful moment when he was at Chautauqua was he was a wonderful singer. He had a great voice. He knew music extremely well. And when they were about to sing, he was in the Hall of Philosophy, and he just told his story, and they were about to sing God of Grace and God of Glory Pour Your Power on Us. And he looked very tired, and his wife said to me, we better get the wheelchair. And then she said, on second hand, let him go if he has to. She said, he's going to sing this one more time. Yeah. And I want him to sing it with all of the power he wants. Because he looked at her when she put her hand on the wheelchair, and he went. And we all went, okay, go ahead. He was like Ralph. I mean, so many people in this room that I've seen in these conditions, and I remember Ralph, this won't mean anything on the tape, but it means a lot to me. Remember when Ralph, and you would say to Ralph, you know, Ralph, you got to stay awake because we have to talk to Joan about this service. And he was in a lot of pain, and he would do it for a little while. And then he'd go, please, just give me the medicine again. It's all right, whatever you do. I mean, and it's for all these people, what I learned was when you come to the moment of giving up your life, if you've lived a life that you have some feeling about that life being worthwhile, I can't even do this. It was like so powerful that people know that, you know, what comes, and there's a sense of life and death that is really a privilege to be part of in people's lives. So Bill Coffin meant a lot to me.
You wanted us to talk about heroes of the ecumenical interfaith movement. How would you define a hero of the ecumenical interfaith movement?
Well, you know, I got to thinking about when you said that's what I said, and I don't doubt that's what I said. But I thought, you know...
Welcome to my world. I told my wife who said it. Greg, you really... I may have said it, but I don't believe it.
But I thought, what I was thinking about was that none of us come into our life alone, nor do we accomplish what we accomplish all by ourselves. And for me, everything that I've ever done, there have been people who have been, for me, heroes and heroines, and people who, like Coffin, people who were my teachers. They would never have said that. They wouldn't have thought about that. But I got to thinking about the privilege I've had to get to know a lot of people whom the world would think of as fairly famous people. But in the long run, what they really were people who, they were teachers, and they were mentors. And they not only taught me, but they gave their life to a movement for unity and for justice and for freedom. And I thought about all the people I've known who played that role and how important that was. And that if I were to tell another story other than what's in the book I wrote, it would be about the people that I've met and what they've done and the role they played.
So I'm really impressed with the fact I'm reading this book on the plane. We just came back from Panama Canal, and I'm preparing myself for tonight. And I noticed that there is a chapter which begins, so I am reading, and it says, it's called Living into Hope. 2 weeks ago, I personally had noted the reference to your granddaughter, Kate Ramsey. What does it feel like to have more years behind you than ahead of you? Now, I felt like that, too, as I was traveling. The reason I was traveling, because I was now turning 60. And I thought, my gosh, this is what Cindy's telling me, too, you know? How should I feel? Let's go to Panama Canal. So, but how did you, I mean, you quoted this in your book, and is that part of the driving force of a Joan Brown Campbell saying, I better pause, reflect on this particular type so that my granddaughter Katie could understand a little bit more about me?
Well, you know, it was when she asked that question, and people here who know Katie know that this is characteristic of Kate. Katie always, whatever went into her mind came out her mouth, which was at times a little tricky, but as she was, especially the older she got a little more disciplined about this. But when she said to me, it was my 75th birthday, and that's when she asked me that question. She said, what's it feel like to have more years behind you than ahead of you? And my daughter, with horror, looked at her and said, you cannot ask that kind of a question. And I said, that's a good question, really. And at that year, I got an honorary degree from St. Lawrence. And I did this sermon that I had to give on that subject. And I said, you know, not only is it she have a right to ask it, it's absolutely the right question. And I said, Katie, it all depends on what happened in the years behind you. Mm-hmm. If you find yourself at a certain point wishing your life had been different, wishing you had made a lot of other decisions, completely taken up by your past life, then you will be miserable that you don't have enough years ahead of you to correct it. But if as you look back, you think, I've made mistakes, I haven't done everything right, but basically, I feel like the life behind me was a life worth living and that I've given to people that I love and care about. And then it's okay, because whatever years you have ahead of you are not years of sorrow or making up or being sorry for what went in. That's so tragic. You can live, those years are almost a gift. It's like I've lived those other years, so this year I'll be 80. And so it's like thinking, okay, those years behind me are good years, and I can look back on them and feel good about them. Not because I did everything right or holy or proper or any of those things, but because I feel all right about them. And for me, it was a great question. It made me think about it.
Karen Armstrong in the book also refers to you reflecting on the Buddhist meditation known as the immeasurable. And immeasurable based on action and practice. I mean, that's how she's defined it. Do you think that's an accurate reflection?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about that particularly. I mean, Karen being Karen, I know her very well, she knows me very well, and if she thinks that, then it's probably true. I mean, I feel good about the years behind me, and I feel good about the years ahead of me.
Yeah.
There's a number of things I still want to do, so.
And the next book is hopefully this is the beginning of that.
Well, one of the things I said to you was that they've asked me to think about another book to talk about people that have influenced my life. And there's a lot of people, Coffin being one.
As you kind of start ticking them off, and part of what we're hopefully going to do today a little bit is maybe just try to tick off a few of those. Is Dr. Elbert Pennybacker, is he one of them?
Definitely. He was my pastor when I was very young. He came to our congregation when both of us were 33 years old. Children. I didn't think so then, but I realize now we were really children.
Yeah.
And it was in the heyday of the civil rights movement, and that was when Martin Luther King was working in Cleveland, and I got a lot of my my baptism really with that congregation, trying to work with Martin Luther King and bring him to our congregation. And it never occurred to me it would be so upsetting to people as it was.
Yeah. And you mentioned Dr. King. Would he fit into that book of yours?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, he was very powerful in my life, and I'll tell you why. For different reasons than often people say. I mean, for me, I was brought up in the church. My grandfather was a minister. But I have to say that as I went to college, like many college students, I didn't go to church very much. And I was not sure, other than the ritual of church, what it meant to me. And what Dr. King did for me was to say, here's what faith is about. It's about making a better world for people. And because he lived that so profoundly, I look back and think that really changed my life, and it made me a person. That was when I decided to be ordained as a minister. That was when church began to matter to me, because I thought, it's not about what you, as Karen Armstrong would say, it's not about what you believe alone. It's what you do with what you believe. Mm-hmm. And then it all made sense to me, and that's what King did. He helped me to see that in his own life. I mean, he didn't say those words. I just watched. And I thought, here's someone willing to give their whole life for what they believe, and that was a very powerful influence.
You spend a lot of time in this most recent book, which was, for those who haven't read it, this is a terrific, terrific read, on Carl Sagan. And I know you recount the story dealing with you and Bill Moyers attending that Nobel laureate,
That's right.
which is terrific. And at the end, after the letter that he wrote, which of course he was unable to be there, Bill Moyers comments to you, the man is a believer without acknowledging it. Does he fit your definition of a hero of the interfaith ecumenical movement?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, Carl was not a believer. He was an agnostic, and he said, we used to have long conversations, and he would say to me, you're so smart. Why do you believe in God? And I would say to him, you're so smart. Why don't you believe in God? And we would have this argument like Don Greenhouse and I would have. I mean, there's long...
But I saw what happened earlier today. You brought him along.
Well, we had a rather special incident that helped to bring it along. But it was... No, I think Carl Sagan was very, very special in my life because he challenged me. And he said, you have to explain to me. Why do you believe what you believe? What does it do for you? How do you, I mean, and because he challenged me, it made me have to think intellectually about what I believed, why I believed it. And I suppose for me, a very powerful moment was he died of cancer, of bone cancer. And when he died, he had left word with his wife that I should help do his service. Well, I was shocked. That I said, Carl Sagan wants a service when he dies? I mean, and he wants a Protestant minister to do something about it. And he had a son who was studying to be a rabbi. And he did the Kaddish, the traditional Jewish service. And then he had asked his wife to tell me that he wanted me to say something about him and who he was and what he believed. And he used to say, it doesn't make any difference what we believe about how the earth was formed. That's irrelevant. What matters is that we all agree that it has to be saved. So we should put aside all these differences that we have and agree that the earth needs to be saved. Because he was one of the really, he was, for me, the introduction to the environmental movement and why it mattered. I mean, he used to say that our greatest sin is our human, what he called the human conceit. And I used to say to him, we call it sin. He said, well, call it sin. I call it the human conceit, that we believe that we alone matter. And the place he and I joined was that he really believed that we are all joined together and that everybody matters to everybody, everything matters to everything, that we're all one piece of it. And that was a very powerful message. That's an ecumenical message.
Yes, yeah. William Sloane Coffin, as part of his trilogy of his points that he wanted to make was, of course, that the law of force may never be greater than the force of law, which for us at the Jackson Center, that's a very important position to take.
Right.
And that is embodied in your book on several occasions when you talk, especially with reference to South Africa, with specific reference. We're going to have, ironically, Richard Goldstone is coming back.
Really?
Yeah, so he'll be here in late August, and he was intimately involved with the Truth and Reconciliation
Right.
and that whole Nelson Mandela. But you make reference to a couple of individuals who I frankly did not know, but I wonder if they fit onto your list as well. And one of them is Byers, and I'm going to butcher the last name, but is it Naughty?
Nade. Bears Nade, he pronounced
Would
it.
he fit that definition?
Absolutely.
What?
He was an amazing man. Bears Nade is an unknown name for most people, not in South Africa. In South Africa, he's a hero. He was a member of the Broederbond, which was the selected leadership of South Africa, and he was selected to be one day the president of South Africa. He was a white Afrikaner, and his story is a fabulous story. He was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. He was the minister of South Africa's equivalent of Riverside Church.
Mm-hmm.
He was South Africa's Bill Coffin. Mm-hmm. And in those days, he had black servants, and they were not allowed to come into the dining room where the family was. And one day, one of his servants broke into the dining room, and Bayers said to him, what's wrong? Because he said he knew very well that this man would not break the rules. And he said, my wife is having a baby, she's dying. I have to go back to Crossroads, which was where all the poor people lived. And he said, Dr. Nade, could you take me? And that was the first time Bayers had ever been in the blacks, in Crossroads, where all the poor people lived and where all the people who served him. And he came away from there, and he realized this woman had no doctor, the baby died, she didn't, but he said, you know, I cannot live anymore the way I live. I'll now join the anti-apartheid movement. And when he announced that to his congregation, they took his robe off and they hung it backwards on his pulpit chair and essentially defrocked him and said, you will no longer be a minister in this church. And he said, they put him under house arrest. He was under house arrest for 25 years. And he finally negotiated the contract between Mandela and de Klerk, because he maintained his relationship to the Broederbond, but he also became trusted by the blacks. And I came to know him because he was the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches when I was the General Secretary of the National Council in the United States. And he said, I will keep this job as long as until there is a black person that can take this job. And when that happens, I will immediately step down and turn this role over. And that person was Desmond Tutu that took that job. And when Desmond stepped down, a young man by the name of Frank Chikane, who's coming to Chautauqua this summer to tell the story of Bayers Nade. So I am thrilled that he's coming to tell the story.
Frank is in the book, and
Yeah.
that was my next person. So why don't
Yeah.
you give us a little teaser about Frank.
Frank Chikane came to my house in New York when he was, he'd been under house arrest in South Africa. He was considered armed and dangerous person. He left and he went to England. And then there came a point in the struggle when they needed Frank back. And so he came, they had asked me, well, this was now I knew Bayers. And so Bayers said, would you agree to have him stay with you? So he would have a month to think about whether he felt he could come back into the country. And so he stayed for me for a month. He's prayed, he thought, and finally he decided he would go back, whatever the risk would be. And he then returned to South Africa, even though he was at that point putting himself in a very dangerous position. But he became then a part of the movement. And the greatest story I know about Frank was he was considered by the South African government, of course, to be a threat because of his commitment to ending apartheid. His wife was a linguist, and much to my surprise, if you study African languages, do you know where the best place is that you can study it? Who would know? The University of Wisconsin. And they have the best studies in African languages of any place in the world. So his wife came to Wisconsin to study, and he came to visit her. And he was only here a couple of days when he became very ill, near death, and they put him in the emergency room. He was there for a couple of days, and he suddenly got very much better. He went home, this was repeated 3 times. Went home, he got better. Fortunately, they also have a strong department on studying poison. And they said, there's something happening here, and we think he's been poisoned. And you know, the South Africans used to say that if you sent your clothes to the dry cleaner, they could poison your clothes and send them back to you. They could put poison in the clothes. And everybody went, no, it's not possible. And then they said at the University of Wisconsin, that's what had happened. Because every time he came to the hospital, you see, he put on hospital clothes. Yeah. And then he got better. And so they realized that he was being poisoned. So he's paid heavy dues for what he believed.
We'll look forward to hearing him and his story. Is Bayers still alive?
No.
You also talk about Otis Moss Jr. and the third. Would they be on your list?
They would be on my list, for sure. I mean, Otis Moss Sr. was one of the major black pastors, still is in Cleveland, probably one of the most respected. His son, Otis Moss Jr., whom people at Chautauqua know well, or Otis Moss III he is, went to Chicago, which would have been a kind of normal progression for a very talented young man, except that he happened to go to the church where Jeremiah Wright had been the preacher. And anyone who happened to have watched the struggle around the election of Obama would know that that was Obama's church. And that was, there's a long, long story about what it meant to him when he went there. And so both of them I would put in my category of people who've taught me things.
Well, you should maybe just do a little bit of a story on yourself, because you were asked to give a sermon right in the heart of the Obama controversy, which Otis Moss inherited.
Yes, he did.
And how'd you feel about, first of all, being asked, and second of all, walking into a, no doubt, well-publicized opportunity to talk, and people, I'm sure, were taking notes?
Well, you know, in most of my life, I've gone out on the end of a limb and somebody's sawing it off behind me, and I never really quite knew that that was happening. I mean, I can't tell you that I honestly understood until I got there, and there were police surrounding the church. There were demonstrators on all sides of the issue of Obama. And when I walked in, I thought, all right, I understand what's happening here. And I mean, I felt good about the fact that I could go and that I could be useful to Otis the third, because I admired him very much. as a young man, and I realized he had walked into something he had no idea he had walked into. Because at that point, Jeremiah Wright was not giving up easily. He had decided he was going to step down, and then when it all got so ugly and complicated, he wasn't sure. So Otis was also in the middle of a church battle. And it finally came out all right, but it was a very tough struggle for him. So I was very pleased to be able to preach and to tell him that there were lots of people around the world, certainly in the United States, that were praying for him and for his ministry. It's a wonderful church. I mean, it was a church that changed the entire neighborhood. And the sad thing is that Jeremiah Wright played a huge role in taking a poverty neighborhood and giving it some strength. But when we got into the election, it got very bitter and very ugly, and I think they all paid for it.
The aspect was, in many senses, the religious teachings, which kind of worked its way into politics and into also the endorsement, the Obama connection. And yet, in your book, you talk a little bit about Otis Moss Sr., the second, I'm not sure which it is, but...
The father.
His father. And kind of your reverence for him, or you're certainly during the civil rights movement, but all of a sudden you got into a situation personally where it got a little awkward.
Well, in those days it got very awkward. I mean, but I guess as I look back on my life...
Maybe I didn't give a good backdrop of that for the audience here. He had originally, or had endorsed your daughter.
He endorsed my daughter.
When she ran for mayor and
Right.
was elected. And then ran re-election and...
He didn't endorse her the second time. Because...
By the way, it was a non-endorsement. I mean, for everybody.
He didn't not endorse her. He just didn't endorse her. And that was pressure from the black community, because there was this huge pressure for the black community to elect a black mayor. And Jane had been the first white mayor in about 15 years. And in some ways, she was an accident. I mean, that she got elected was not in the order of things that people had expected. And the black community is very large in Cleveland. It's about 57%. It's hard to be mayor of that kind of a city if you're white. And the support of Otis for her election was huge, because the black community, he was very much a hero. And he paid for that himself. I mean, people in the black community were very critical of that. So she was defeated then by the current mayor of Cleveland, who is an African American. So it's very complicated.
Did that tax your sense of humor?
Sure. Sure it did. I mean, did I wish that he had the courage to step up against that pressure from the black community? The problem was, having spent so much of my life struggling with race, I knew too much, and I knew why he probably couldn't do that. I mean, and we know a lot more now about the issues surrounding all that. And for Jane, it was tragic. I mean, she was a good mayor, a very good mayor, and people knew that. And she tried to get everything straight. That was not what people were looking for. They had all the deals made, and she wasn't a deal maker, so that was tough.
Switching gears completely, and maybe it's a little bit of a Jackson moment, because clearly part of our mission is international criminal law and justice, and you stepped into the issue of Yugoslavia, Milosevic, and there was not only kind of activism, but you also, the central person was the patriarch.
That's right.
And would he fit that role?
He definitely would, because it's a great story, because I'd worked as General Secretary at the National Council, and the Orthodox churches were members of the National Council, so I got to know them well. There were about 12 Orthodox churches that were members of the National Council, of a total of 37, so it was a good large body. And he was a member of he was the patriarch of the Serbian Orthodox Church. And so he invited us to come to Serbia and to try to meet with Milosevic. At that point, there were 2 American young men who were prisoners in Yugoslavia. And so we were there to try to get those prisoners freed, and the patriarch became the agent for their freedom. And I will never, ever forget, Jesse Jackson was part of this mission. And I remember Jesse Jackson saying to me, we were going in to meet the patriarch, and so Jesse says to me, well, what do I call him? And I said, you call him Your Holiness. And he said, no shit.
Well, no, that's a religious term, I understand.
And I said, yes, just do it. Don't argue about it. Just do it. Well, Jesse Jackson is about 6'6".
Yeah.
And the patriarch's about 5'3". And so Jesse walks into the room. The patriarch has his robes on. And Jesse looks at him, and he looks at me, and I go, just do it. Just do it. And so he greets him as Your Holiness and sits down, and the patriarch begins to speak. And he thanks us for being there and for putting ourselves in harm's way under the bombs of our own nation, because they were still bombing when we were there. And for the willingness to go to the Milosevic and challenge him. And then in the middle of his speech, he pulled up his robe and he said, he had blue jeans on. And he said, I'm going back to where I served originally, where the Muslims are. And he said, I need to speak with them. And I will leave you to do, and Jesse Jackson looked at me and he said, Your Holiness. I said, you're right. He is a brave man. And so it was amazing. And then the prisoners were freed, so it was amazing.
Did you catch up with him after the prisoners were released? Did you have a final meeting?
Yes, we did. Mm-hmm.
What was his reaction to all this?
Well, he was shocked that we got he didn't think we would get the prisoners freed. But he was beyond grateful. We had a delegation of about 20 religious leaders, including a lot of the Orthodox. And I think he was probably singularly responsible for unseating Milosevic, because he stood against him and against all odds and against his own government. And so I think that, he felt very good about what we did. The only thing he said to us was, when we were told that Milosevic sent word that they would put the prisoners into our hands, and then before we got the prisoners, we met with the patriarch, and he said, my suggestion is you leave town as soon as you have them, as fast as you can. And I still remember that they came in, when we went to get them, we went 5 a.m. to the jail, and they came in and their shoes were tied to each other, the laces in their shoes. And the Red Cross came in, because they always do when there's a prisoner exchange, and they reached down, they untied their shoes, and they came over. We were sitting at a table, and they were across the room from us. And the member of the Milosevic government just simply said, you are free, men. It was quite a moment. And they walked over to the table, and they had set up phones so they could call their parents. They were young, very, very young. And they called their parents, and they wanted to know who won the World Series. That was one of the first questions. While we were here, who won the World Series? I thought, I can't believe this, but I mean,
I can.
that was their question. That was their question. But it was great. Then we took them home, so.
You just used the term, you are free. You were a witness to, we're going to go backwards, we're going to go to the event and then go backwards, when Elian Gonzalez was reunited with his dad. Why don't you talk about that, and then we're going to go back a little bit on that story.
Well, of course, of all the things I've done, that may have been the most controversial in funny ways. It's hard for me to think that was more controversial than Milosevic or more controversial than the civil rights movement, because of the special relationship that the United States doesn't have with Cuba and the tension that exists between Cuba and the United States. And it just seemed to me that it was so ultimately logical that this little boy, who was 5 years old when he was found off the coast of Florida, his mother had been in a raft where these people were leaving Cuba. And they found him, he was the sole survivor. And when they found him, they brought him on shore, and there's a kind of very strange law in the United States that's called wet foot, dry foot. And the minute that a Cuban is placed on shore, then they become immediately the prisoner of the United States. And so he was then immediately under the law of the United States. And then the issue was, because when he was 5, and when he woke up in the hospital, he asked to talk to his father. And his father said to him, "You have an uncle in Miami." And it was his father's brother, not his own father, but his grandfather's brother. And they had no idea that if they turned him over to the grandfather's brother, that the grandfather's brother would insist that he stay there rather than going back to Cuba. So that's how the fight began, about aliens, where he was going.
And I remember the last time we were here, I showed a clip. Cindy and I were in Havana, Cuba, in a hotel watching CNN, and there we saw Joan Brown Campbell, who we'd just seen a week earlier at Chautauqua, wondering, this is such a strange world. And here we are. And you were obviously very instrumental in all that entire process, and through the intervention, the Supreme Court ultimately got involved in making that decision as it became more of a jurisdictional question. But then you were there when Elian was handed back to, is it Juan Miguel?
Yes, his father, to Juan Miguel.
How'd you feel about that?
And to his grandparents.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, well, I was not actually physically present. I was present to put him on the plane from the United States.
Right.
What we decided in the end was that he should go on the plane with his father. His father was then in the United States, and he was reunited with his father in the United States. Right. And then we decided that what he should do is go back to Cuba on the plane without any Americans with him. So, and then Fidel Castro had promised that he would not meet the plane, that there would be no government presence, but that the grandparents would be there, and they were there to meet him. So he actually went back and was received into the arms of his family. And it was remarkable. I mean, in order to get him from Washington, D.C. to the plane, it was the whole time we were riding with him in the car, there was helicopters up above, because there were threats on his life as he approached the plane to leave. So, right to the very end. I remember watching him the night before the Supreme Court made their decision, and he's a very little boy, a very beautiful child. And I looked at him, and I remember saying to him, "Little child, you have no idea what has swirled around you," because he was this peaceful-looking little child, you know. He's 17 now, and he's teaching first grade. And the most irony to me of all is he's an excellent athlete. And you know what his sport is? Long-distance swimming. Not to be believed. I mean, it's really, they live in an island, so it isn't as ironic as it seemed to me that this would be his sport. But he was never afraid of the water. I was always amazed at that with what he'd been through. He was not, and he used to tell the story, and they've gone into some research on this, that when we took him to the aquarium in Washington, because we were trying to entertain him while he was waiting for the court, and he looked at the dolphins we came to the dolphins, and he goes, "Amigos, amigos." And, we said, "Elian, what?" And he said, "They're my friends. They were when I was on the raft." And he talked about how they put their nose up to him and pushed him onto the raft. And all the research shows that dolphins will do that. So he actually, what a story. It's an amazing story. And he's just as kind, and he always calls me Mama Jane, Mama Joan, Mama Jane, whichever one he can think of. And Joan is not in Spanish, whoever speaks Spanish. It's Joanne. They don't have any word for Joan itself, so. But I try as often as I can to see him, because I feel very close to him.
Well, you received a call from him on a very unique day in our history. Why don't you talk about that?
Oh, this was
September
9/11,
11th, yeah.
9/11, September 11th. He and his father called me and said that they just wanted me to know that they were thinking about us. And where was I? I was at some shopping with my granddaughter, I think, like all of us. We didn't know, 9/11 was not what we expected to have happen. And so They said they just wanted us to know that the Cuban people were with us and thinking about us. And
That's
it's amazing.
remarkable.
Yeah.
Would you put your grandfather in this list?
What an interesting question. My grandfather was a Presbyterian minister. He was a Calvinist to the core, for any Presbyterians that are listening. Very strict, he was not a fundamentalist. He was very conservative in his beliefs. And I suppose, yes, I would in one way, because he was the one who most, I think, I remember in my life talking about the meaning of faith. He was very big on mission. He believed that we had to go into other parts of the world, we had to serve the poor. So lots of the themes of my life were also part of his. But I most of all remember he had more rules than I knew what to do with. I mean, you couldn't play cards on Sunday, you couldn't go to the movie, you couldn't do a whole lot of things. And I used to argue about that. Still do, actually. I'm not a rule fan.
Karen Armstrong is very much part of, she wrote the foreword to your book, and you talk about her experience here right after 9/11, coming to Chautauqua. Would she make the list?
Oh yeah, for sure. I've learned a lot from Karen. I mean, I think we've learned from each other. She's become really a sister. I mean, she's a scholar and a writer. And the summer that she came, we had invited her to come to spend a whole summer with us every Friday talking about Islam. Well, that was before 9/11. And all of a sudden, everything changed. And she found herself under attack, I mean, trying to defend Islam in the middle of what had just happened. And so it was a very difficult summer for her. She's not a person used to the public or used to public controversy. She's changed a lot on that, but that was a very tough summer. So that's when I got to know her the best.
Was it tough on you?
Sure. Well, you don't like, I mean, you know, but I learned a lot from her. I remember when people would say, how can you possibly say, we'd have these wonderful 9 Muslim speakers, one each week. And where's Don Greenhouse? You were there every day. And people would say to Karen, you know, how can you possibly do this when these people have just done this? And then she would try to very patiently say, well, let's think about the Christians. What about the Ku Klux Klan? What about the Inquisition? What about the things the Christians did that also we would not be proud of as we look backwards and now forwards? And she said, this is what we have to remember, is we've seen the worst of Islam, but it isn't the whole of Islam. And I think for me, she was a real teacher on the issue of Islam, and how do you look at something like that in a time when we've just been through something like 9/11.
Let me ask a tough question.
Yeah.
If you were sitting back and looking at you, would you put yourself on this list?
Yeah. Yeah, I would.
Why?
I'd put people on this list that have taken risks for what they believe, and suffered some for what they believe, and not been afraid to speak out for what they think is right and fair and just. And I would hope that if something happens to me someday, somebody out here will say that.
I don't doubt that they will.
You would.
Shortly, I'm going to be running for a battery pack here, so that I'm pausing for a second. Dr. Graham, did you know him?
I did. I liked him very much.
Is he part of this list?
He would definitely be part of my list. He was very different than what, there's a great story about Billy Graham and me, which was he came to see me when I was General Secretary of the National Council, and he came in, he's a very big man, and he came in and he sat down and introduced himself, and I introduced myself, and I said, Dr. Graham, we're pleased to have you, and why have you come? I didn't think he was a big friend of the National Council of Churches. And he said, I've come to thank the National Council for the integrity of my ministry. And my first reaction was, where is the press? When you know, because he's always thought of as a big critic of the National Council. And so he mentioned by name the man who had been head of evangelism at the National Council of Churches. And he said he taught me two extremely important lessons. One was, don't ever ask for money. Have a board of directors and take a salary. And be responsible to a board of directors. Don't ask for money. It'll only get you in trouble. And the second is, don't ever be in a room with a woman with the door closed. And he looked up and he said, well, unless it's the general secretary. And I thought that was a Billy Graham I didn't know. And then we talked a long time, maybe for an hour. And I asked him who would take his mantle when he died or when he was ready to give up. And he said, it should be my daughter, but we're not smart enough to do that now.
Right.
He said, in the church I'm from, we won't do that. And I never forget that. I thought it was, and he talked about one of his children had had a drug problem. He was very straightforward, very honest. And then he looked at me and he said, I'm here to do a crusade. And would you be willing to speak on the platform? Well, I'd grown up in a family that went to, my father loved Billy Graham, and I said, sure, I'll do that. But when I walked out of the room and his people were there, he said, I've asked her to speak, and they did, you did what? And they said no, so it never happened. But he was very much a part of who was in control of him, I think, as a human being. And he talked about his time of recognizing that he had not done enough for peacemaking and when he was in the Soviet Union. So that was, it was a very important discussion.
Yeah.
Then he went downstairs, and because I had said to him, you cannot come into this building that's full of people from the church in New York and not at least speak to the crowd. And his people didn't want him to do that, and he said he would do it. And it was, people were from the rafters. I mean, everybody came to hear him.
Yeah.
And he was great. He was very good. So we're not always how we appear to be in the public eye, I think.
Who else fits that category?
Oh, well, I mean, there's probably a lot of people. I mean, I've been lucky. I mean, certainly Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela. I mean, and I've been so blessed to have met these people and known them, and not kind of as famous people. I don't think of them that way. It was people whose struggle was engaged in a way that connected to what I was doing. And so there'd be a lot of people like that I would put in that category. Lots of people that you learn from and that help to educate you. They would never think of the fact they had done that, I don't think.
You've been here since 2000, year 2000, you've been in Chautauqua. In your faith growth during that time period, have there been certain individuals who've sort of helped put you to that next, maybe I'd say level, but who've...
Well, a part of what happened to me when I came here was, I came here out of the ecumenical movement. And I was very clear about the need for people to be of one faith. What happened to me when I came here was that the members of the Jewish community and then the Muslim community helped me to understand the interfaith movement and what it was, and that changed my theology almost entirely. I mean, I really have changed a lot since I came. The other issue I've dealt with enormously, people out here know this, was the gay issue. I mean, was a time when we said women couldn't be in the pulpit. We don't say that at Chautauqua now. We welcome women here. That isn't to say there aren't still some, and we've really wrestled with this, because what is the issue? That's a very important question, Alice. How do we decide what are the issues that are so compelling about justice and right and wrong that we say we're going to stand for something? Because you can't stand for everything. It's one thing to have different opinions on foreign policy, on who should be president, on Democrats and Republicans. All of those issues have to be wrestled with. But there are some issues that I think are not of that nature. And that's part of what the issue is in that.
Would an evangelical who said that all non-Christians are going to hell be acceptable?
Said that no.
How
But
you-
would we know that?
Yeah, how would you know that?
We wouldn't always know that. We did, however, have just this year, we had a very famous, I won't say who it is, television star, a minister, who is very anti-gay. Well, he would say it this way: God loves all people, but God would love gay people not to be gay. And, you know, I said, no, we're not going to have that minister. Because that position, to me, is so wrong in terms of human life and human freedom and human nature. Any more than if someone said to me, I think black people are lesser people than white people. I mean, pretty much we've made peace with that. Not everybody. There's still prejudice in this place. But I think we would be hard put to have a minister that was an out-and-out racist. And I think the issue of gay people and of the whole lifestyle issue, not even gay marriage, we're beginning to move in that direction. That isn't to say there aren't people that don't agree with that. But I think there are only a very few things that, in fact, you have to say, that's not balance, that's wrong. And it's very, what do you think? I mean, it's tricky.
Yeah.
But, I mean, can you really say that every opinion that people have is welcome and that we authenticate that as gospel? I mean, people can say what they want, but to say from the pulpit that this is God's will for us, that we should treat people not equally, to me, there's every evidence that that's not where we ought to be. Not everybody agrees with me. I do know that. In this room, maybe, but out there in the bigger world, no. I think it's tougher.
Or even an issue like climate change. I mean, there's so much falsehood being perpetrated in the name of, so, you know, you could contend easily that you have to have people representing both sides of the issue.
You could.
When really it's been decided by the
Yeah.
scientific community.
Absolutely.
And the truth is that those who are saying it hasn't are not actually correct.
No, I guess if you pressed me, I would say that I'm not sure I know how to say this. I know in my heart what I think is different about that. I happen to be on the side of people who believe that it's been decided that climate is a result of human behavior. But to take that issue and only take one side of it, I think we can't do that. We have to listen to both sides of it. But if you take the nature of a human person, their race, their sexuality, their gender, these are not things anyone can change. I mean, you have to believe this now. If people believe that gay people can be straight people and they can, then you got a whole other set of arguments. But people can't change their race, they can't change their gender, and I don't think they can change their sexuality. So if you take a position against things that people cannot change, you can change your mind on climate. You can't change your race. And so prejudice that is rooted in saying people have to be different than who it's even possible for them to be. Women can't be men. And so then I think you've got a different set of issues.
Well, you have those who say you can change your sexual orientation.
I know that. Pretty much I think science is beginning to say it's not going to happen.
Joan, while we have just a few more minutes, you've got notes.
Well, I always have notes.
Me. You know, and this hopefully will not be, this is just the first of maybe many opportunities to talk. But is there something there in those notes that you were hoping that I would ask that obviously I failed miserably in not asking?
Well, I guess the only person that we haven't talked about was Nelson Mandela,
Yes.
who, for me, is really an amazing human being. And I felt very privileged to know him. I stood behind him when he voted in the election that made him the president of South Africa. And he's a very, very simple, complicated, yes, but to me, the greatest lesson that Mandela taught us was when he walked out of prison and people said to him, you know, Mandela, you know, you have been a prisoner for over almost 30 years. Why don't you hate them? And he said, because if I hate them, I will be their prisoner for the rest of my life. And to me, that was one of the most powerful statements. And I've watched him live that life. He simply will not hate the people that hated him. He just said, no, I cannot do that. I have to forgive them. I mean, if you take Karen Armstrong's view of compassion, to me, he would have been the ultimate compassionate person who said, it is not my job to hate these people, and it will only make me their prisoner. And I thought it was a huge lesson. And he's a wonderful person. I mean, you know, I remember saying to him one day something about, I said, how are you? And he said, I'm old. And he said, the great victory for me is getting up in the morning. And he said, if nothing hurts and I can get out of bed, it's a good day. Yeah. And I thought, wow. I mean, he's such in many ways, a simple person for all that he's been through. I mean, clearly, you just look at people like that and you think, you want to say, what made you that way? How did you get so that you can forgive people, that you can have taken all that you've taken and still move forward in a positive direction? I mean, it's quite remarkable.
Tonight we've mentioned a number of individuals, and I'm sure when we get done and we'll remember more, but what are the characteristics that you, if you could pause and say, and you write that final chapter and you say, I've just highlighted 10 individuals who, to me, Joan Brown Campbell, are heroes. What they all had in common was, how would you fill that blank?
I think I would say what they all had in common was humility. None of them. We didn't talk about Sister Joan Chittister, who'd clearly be one of my heroines. None of them had a sense that they were special. They honored who they were, they honored their gifts, but they didn't denigrate other people. They were always learners. Everybody that I talked about, Bill Coffin included, they always felt there was something they didn't know, something they could learn. They could always be better people. And I think the other thing is every single one of them had courage. They had the courage to say what they believed. They didn't play games with people. They said what they believed, they put it forward, and yet they loved people. Every one of them, you feel the love. They might disagree with people, they might have an argument with them, but they didn't not love people. I mean, they had a sense of deep sense of right and wrong and a deep sense of the love of humanity, and I think that's really what they all have in common.
Karen Armstrong, from the foreword, said, Joan Brown Campbell's career can be regarded as prophetic. For Joan, faith has meant engagement with the world and its pain. Her words remind us that at its best, religion should not narrow our horizons, but enable us to live more fully. Should not cause us to withdraw from the world, but to do our utmost to make it a better place. And you have, and I want to say thank you. This has been terrific today.
Thank you. The fan club.